Kingdom Hearts 3 is probably the game that has had the most controversy and discourse regarding its quality in the series.
At first glance, especially when it initially came out, it seems as if many people were disappointed with it. And to this day, you still hear this sentiment being said. However, when looking at review scores from both players and critics, the consensus surrounding the game today seems to be a lot more positive. Part of it has to do with its post-launch contents and updates, such as Remind, that address some of the issues people had with the game. However, I believe that there were real psychological aspects to the game and its launch that made people more disappointed with the game than they otherwise would have been. I personally love the game and consider it one of my favorites. However, clearly most people didn't just have an illusion of being disappointed with KH3. There were real reasons for it. I will be presenting these aspects that I believe contributed to the disappointment that many felt towards KH3,
beyond the gameplay and story aspects.
For this, I have laid out what I call the 5 keys that explain this phenomena. The first one is marketing and spoilers. Yeah, so a majority of fans played most of the games without marketing having been a major player in how they ended up playing the series. Perhaps you saw a commercial for it when you were a kid or something and decided to buy it at the store, or maybe you saw it at the store one day and picked the game up. Or maybe you heard about the series in the modern day, saw some gameplay of it, maybe a trailer, got a recommended from a friend, and then played through the series. For most of us, we were never there for an entire marketing cycle for a game, in which we see multiple trailers for the same game with all the worlds and characters being revealed to us in these trailers. That was until Kingdom Hearts 3. KH3 followed quite a standard marketing pattern to previous games. They reveal most of the key characters, as well as essentially revealing all of the worlds that are featured in the game. Yes, even KH2 did this, but we weren't around for the marketing cycle for this. We saw a couple of commercials maybe on TV, at most, but we certainly didn't sit there on Twitter waiting for the next trailer to appear so that we can watch it as soon as it comes out. Not only did this marketing cycle for KH3 reveal more than what we were used to seeing when we first boot up a KH game, but the way in which they showed the trailers and the context in which they appear in, that is, this being a long-term conclusion to a saga that we have gone through since KH1, it's really what sealed it. What I really mean is, the KH3 trailers had spoilers. A lot of it. Essentially, the whole plot was spoiled. Major character reveals, every area. There were almost no surprises left for us. I mean, heck, one of them is literally called the Final Battle trailer, and it's almost 4 minutes long with just tons of endgame spoilers. What the? And considering this was the conclusion to a saga that had been spanning well over a decade, people of course had this very high expectation over the story. Yet when they played and realized that they already knew what was about to happen, one can't help but to leave disappointed. I noticed that people who hadn't watched the trailers were visibly much more excited during said scenes that were spoiled for other people. Understandably so, considering that they indeed had no idea about the crazy things that were about to occur. Everything from which a character to appear, to which Disney worlds they are in, to even smaller things like Remy from Ratatouille appearing as the chef in Traverse Town. All of these things were spoiled. There was no room for novelty or surprises, no charm that comes from discovering something for the first time. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with the quality of the game. It is not the developer's fault. It's all because of the marketing department at Square Enix and Disney. One shouldn't judge the game because of this. However, the experience itself was ruined, and so one can't help but be disappointed at the game because of it. The second reason are Disney worlds and the story's overall pacing, which I consider to go hand in hand. Not the song. The Disney worlds and its pacing is one of the main complaints that I've heard regarding Kingdom Hearts 3. Mainly the fact that they all feel like filler. Like the previous games had meaning to their worlds, while this one doesn't. And thus the worlds in Kingdom Hearts 3 just feels like padding, like filler. And the pacing of the story therefore just feels bad. You just want to get through these quote useless worlds in order to fight the organization already. However, what if I were to tell you, and this is one of the only times in this video where I will state that something is objectively true or false in regards to opinions of the game, but what if I told you that you are wrong? The Disney worlds are in fact not filler. They were not even badly paced. In fact, they are some of the most important Disney worlds in the entire Kingdom Hearts franchise. But there is also a very big reason for why people feel otherwise. People aren't just wrong for the sake of being wrong. There's a very understandable reason, and that reason is the Disney World's importance, or the story importance, in KH3 is very retrospective. You see, previously in the series, most Disney Worlds and their importance was a lot more obvious. In KH1, you go to a world, you defeat one of the Disney villains, who were the main antagonistic group of the game. You meet Riku, who explains what has happened to him, and Kairi, and you build a newly made relationship with your companions. In 2, you search for your friends, come into contact with the organization, kill one of them straight up, end up going inside Ansem's computer, which turns out to be the Tron world, and yeah, you get the picture. Even when the worlds aren't always important, they still manage to feel it when they eventually are. In KH3 though, most worlds are important, but it is impossible to realize it until you have completed the game. Let's take Toy Box for example. This is the most obvious example I can make, since at first, Verum Rex seems to just be a random video game thing in Toy Box, and so when we leave Toy Box, we feel as if we learned nothing there, like there was no point to it. As we see later though, Verum Rex all of a sudden becomes very important to Kingdom Hearts 3's overall plot, and that fucking damn dinosaur is suddenly the most important character in the damn franchise. However, there are even more examples of retrospective plot importance in these worlds that are even less obvious. One of them can be found in the very same world. Young Xehanort didn't just spout mumbo jumbo, he was experimenting with how toys can have hearts and how they react when stretched to the limit. A similar thing happened in San Francisco regarding a program that has a heart, yet whose only purpose is to destroy. As we later learn, these were attempts by the organization to experiment with hearts in order to awaken and create Xion, their 13th and final vessel, the perfect combat program with a heart, who also has a connection to Sora. This is something that is extremely hard to figure out when you're just in the actual worlds playing around, and so they do feel like useless filler at first, but once you really think about their content, you suddenly realize how important they really were. Arendelle and Kingdom of Demonetization are somewhat similar, essentially creating the stakes of the game, being that, well, even if the Guardians just decide to not fight Xehanort, he will just go after the princesses, kill them, and just do his plan anyways. Not only does it set up the stakes for this game, but it also sets up what is possibly going to be a future plot point. The whole princesses thing, since we only know a couple of them, and well, being in these worlds led us to find out that there were new princesses, which were these 3 so far. But yeah, like I said, this also affirms the idea that Sora's journey is necessary, as otherwise the Keyblade, the X-Blade, could still be forged using the princesses. But because they aren't featured much in the story, other than in their worlds, people feel as they didn't contribute much. The only other example of them being referenced again is when Sora flashes back to love or something. But as I said, they do indeed contribute in their way. There are some other examples as well, such as finding out about Ventus through Vanitas in Monstropolis, and Vanitas regaining his power and life, essentially, through the Scream energy from children collected from Monsters Incorporated, which, by the way, is literally like the sickest story integration ever, aside from maybe Tron in KH2. In addition, the motivation for going to these worlds was to get the power of waking. And since that never happened in the Disney worlds, it might feel as if the one objective that was had was never even achieved in said worlds, and they were therefore just filler. But even if the motivation for going there was never achieved, that doesn't mean that the events of said world didn't have any relevance to the overall plot. Far from it. Again, thanks to the retrospective and sometimes futurespective importance for most worlds, it can feel as if they are just filler, but the truth is, without the Disney worlds in KH3, we wouldn't even have the entire organization's ranks filled out. We wouldn't have any knowledge of Yozora or Verum Rex. We wouldn't even know the location of Ven's heart, and Sora wouldn't have learned important life lessons. Number 3 is pre-Remind gameplay and story. This one is a bit more of like a general and very understandable critique of how the game was very early on. Kingdom Hearts 3 pre-Remind was certainly different for many reasons. People had many complaints about the game's difficulty, the lack of character interactions, and the lack of different playable characters. For one, the game was way too easy for most people. Even on Proud Mode was it much easier than in previous games. This was fixed through later patches with things like Critical Mode. Attractions were also looked down upon as something which were not only annoying and appeared too often, but made things even easier. They often interrupted boss and battle music as well. This was also fixed through an ability that removes non-essential attractions from appearing. Another source of disappointment was the lack of scenarios with different playable characters. The game teased you with allowing you to play as Riku and Aqua once, setting up the expectation that you might be able to play as them again or as other characters in the Keyblade Graveyard at the very least. However, that never happened. Remind added more story content, interactions, playable characters and other stuff. And Remind is often considered by many players to have fixed most problems that the game had for them, and made the game much more enjoyable for people. The opinions regarding Cage 3 changed a lot since the launch of Remind, and a lot of people who didn't like the game back then considered it now to be one of their favorites. So while a lot of the disappointment for Cage 3 was very vanilla based, the state of the game now has a lot of people really liking it. Number 4. Change is always scary. Cage 3 feels very different. Everything from the tone, to the combat, to its presentation, the game, the graphics. The game feels very different than past entries. Despite its changes not being necessarily bad, it's still something that can elicit a sense of unease with people not used to it. Especially when you've waited many years and expected the game to play a certain way, only to find out that it's quite different than what you expected. I think most people do want the entries to feel different and to have their own identity, but it's never easy to completely jump into something that feels totally different than what you're used to. It certainly takes some getting used to. After all, many, including myself, initially shared the same sentiment along the lines of, this game doesn't feel enough like Cage 2 or something similar. This is one of those things that might have affected people's perception of the game at launch, but goes away over time for many players. My fifth and final reason is long-term expectations. All of these things combined, along with the fact that many have waited over a decade for this game, leads to a natural initial disappointment for the game. Over such a long period of waiting and with hype being a major factor, many people had expectations that were very hard to satisfy from the get-go. One thing to keep in mind is that Cage 3 was a game that was played by what I define as 3 different groups, each with their own reasons for disliking it. Fans of the series, aka the players that have played or watched content from every game up until Cage 3. The other 2 groups are what I define as newcomers and semi-fans of the series. People who have never played a Cage game before, aka newcomers, and people who have played a couple of games perhaps, like just the mainline titles, but hasn't ever played or watched cutscenes from all the other titles such as Birth by Sleep. And, well, as you probably know, Cage 3 requires a lot of context and prior story knowledge in order to be understood properly. The game does not do a good job in explaining the prior story. Because of this, it is of course much harder to enjoy the game and its story and emotional beats when you have no clue what's going on. Therefore, newcomers ended up not liking the game for said reason, and semi-fans expected to understand the story, considering they have played the prior games, like the mainline titles, yet had no idea who the heck Terra and Aqua were, or Xion, etc. This was a major reason for the disappointment with Cage 3 for many people. And you might be asking why this only applies to Cage 3 and not the other titles. That is because the launch of Cage 3 had much more marketing than previous entries, including to newcomers. The game was marketed towards way more people than just Cage fans. And so when they got a game that basically required that you play the prior games, not even just the mainline ones, they were hit with disappointments, understandably so. All these other previously mentioned aspects made it next to impossible for many to not feel a sense of disappointment for this game. I know I did, but now it has become one of my favorite games ever made. Once I separated the trailer's spoilers from the game's content, once I took a step back and realized how important the Disney worlds really were, once I had played Remind's content and judged the game as one complete package, once I learned to accept its change and accept the game's own identity, and once I let go of my past expectations that I once had and judged the game as is, that is of course just my opinion, There are definitely people who have real own personal issues and critiques of the game that cannot be chalked up to some psychological phenomena, but that can be said for every video game really. However, what I have pointed out today was observations that I have witnessed in other people, as well as on myself, for why Kingdom Hearts 3 elicited such a feeling of disappointment that for many people went away after a while, and why that was felt in the first place. Much of this analysis, however, has to do with people that played the game at or near launch. If you're a relative newcomer to the franchise and has played all the games up till Kingdom Hearts 3, what do you think of the game? Were you also disappointed? Did these factors apply to you as well? Let me know in the comments. And as always, may your hearts be your guiding key.